Okay, it is right at 10 o'clock, so I want to be respectful of everyone's time and get this webinar rolling. We'll probably have some people continue to come on in the next minute or two, but we'll just go ahead and get started and they can catch up as they need to. My name is Veronica Watson. I am the Community Programs Manager for the CSBG program at IHCDA. I want to thank you all for joining me and the rest of the CSBG team for this webinar. We are reviewing the CAR tool today. Now, as most of you know, this was supposed to be a well thought out, exciting in-person training, but given the current situation in our state and in our country, we've had to move it to this webinar format. So I do want to say that all of you are going to be muted throughout the presentation. I've got Steve St. John, Justin Bruce, and Vita Morris-May on the line to help keep the webinar going and to review the information that we've got today. So they'll be talking, but the rest of you will stay muted. So please make sure you use the comments and questions feature for this to communicate with us. We will address all the questions at the end of this webinar. We might, if we see a question that should be answered very quickly, we might throw that out. But for the most part, questions will be answered at the end. So if you do have a question at any point, post that and be as specific as possible so that we know what you're referring to. So I'm going to go ahead and get us started today, and then I'll be handing it off to my colleague Justin Bruce to go over very briefly the purpose of monitoring, and then he'll be handing it off to Steve St. John, who will be reviewing the results from the previous round of monitoring, and then he and Justin will be going over updates to the CAR tool for the 2020 season and beyond. And then we'll finish with a Q&A when I'll hop back on and shoot those over to Steve and Justin so they can answer those. So we're hoping to get through most of the information in an hour or less, and then spend the last half hour on questions. So I also want to say, or I ask that you all be patient with us. We do a lot of webinars at IHCDA, but not usually where presenters are at all different locations, and not when everyone is at home. So we've all got pets or children or neighbors that we can't control for. So please just be patient with us as we work through that, and fingers crossed that everything goes well. So before we get started with the actual meat of the presentation, I wanted to throw this information out there so that you all are aware or remember, if it's been a while since you've looked through our employee list, our email list. So if you have any questions after this webinar that are related to CSBG, go ahead and send those to the CSBG email account that we've set up last year. We're using that to help us manage the various questions that we get about the program. You can go ahead and send that to that email account, and then it will be forwarded to whatever staff member can best answer it. But please try and send as much as you can to that email. If you have any questions that are related to a claim, especially after the claim has been submitted, you might want to send that to the claims email first. That is a whole other department that reviews claims, and so they might be able to answer your questions a lot more quickly than we could in the program department. And then you'll see those of us on the CSBG team. We've got Emily Krauser, our newer Director of Community Programs, Steve St. John, who is the manager for monitoring, and he focuses on CSBG. We've got Justin Bruce, our newer fiscal monitor from last year, myself as the programs manager, and then the wonderful Vita Morris-May as our analyst for the program. So with that, I'm going to shoot this over to Justin. Justin, are you ready?
Yep, I'm ready.
Wonderful, take it away.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Justin Bruce. I am the Community Programs Fiscal Monitor. I started back last year in June, so I may or may not have met some of you yet. I'm really good with faces, and unfortunately can't see any faces today. So, but I wanted to go over just the purpose of monitoring, kind of why we're here, why we're employed, and why they pay us to do what we do. So first and foremost, monitoring is required and mandated federally for CSBG, and it's also required practice for all programs under the Community Programs Division. While it is mandated that we provide monitoring, we also go into it with the purpose and idea of continuous improvement. Monitoring is to be used in a way that leads to improved outcomes and the adoption of higher impact strategies. And as always, we perform monitorings as a form of risk mitigation and protection. And very genuinely, at the end of the day, we want and need all of our agencies to thrive and succeed. So we really are here as part of all of our team. So. Okay.
Thanks, Justin. Well, my name is Steve St. John, and I am the manager for monitoring. And what I want to do is take a few moments and just talk about what happened over the last monitoring cycle. So we monitored 22 community action agencies between 2018 and 2019. And we have some of the results of that. It's more of a, this is where we were, so we can transition here in later on in the webinar as to where we're going. And this helps provide some of the guidelines and bars that we want to accomplish as we progress forward over the next monitoring cycle, which will end in 2022. So when we look at two different scores, for the monitoring results, we have the IM 138, the organizational standard score, and as a network, we scored 85.55%. And the overall performance score for the car, which is what we use with that 92% threshold, as the network, we scored 93.04%. So slightly above our minimum threshold, but I am hopefully optimistic as I've talked to people and I've seen practices in place that this number will continue to rise, and that as a network we will perform better. It's kind of, we're getting the nuances, we're figuring out the details, and that's only going to make everybody more successful going forward. So as we go to the next slide, we want to focus on the organizational standards that are met. So we were actually required as part of the CSBG annual report to provide NASCAS with information on how many agencies performed at the levels that you see. Actually their levels are 70 to 79, the 80% range, the 90% range, and the 100% range. So what we did is we just provided you that same information so you can see out of the 22 agencies kind of where everyone is falling. You can see that we had 3 agencies that were below the 69%, and we had 1 agency who had 100% of their organizational standards. They were able to meet those. So as we go to the next slide, I wanted to look at the same thing for the state standards. The card tool itself was designed around the 58 organizational standards, but we also have state standards that we look at. And so I took basically the same philosophy as the same breakdown, the percentages, and just kind of showed everyone that our highest area is 80 to 89%, and 41% of the agencies are meeting our state standards. And state standards come from a variety of places. Mostly they come from some form of state code or the CSBG grant agreement. That's what makes up most of this information. And as we move to the next slide, then we're going to talk about the CSBG car monitor results, but we're going to compare them nationally. And we were provided some information back in 2017, and this is unfortunately the most recent we have, but it kind of gives you a nice comparison. to see how did Indiana compare to the rest of the nation. And the categories are the same categories that you find in the organizational standards. So community input and involvement is category 1, community engagement's category 2. So it gives you a reference as what standards that you're looking at. And you can see that Indiana does extremely well with consumer input and community engagement. And there's also another slide on, or there's another category on the next slide as well. So 3 of the categories we exceed. 2 we're pretty close at, but 5 we are below the national average. And you can see things like the strategic planning, the human resource management, fiscal operations, and even from the previous slide, organizational leadership and board governance. Those are the 5 categories that we struggle in some form or fashion. And it doesn't mean that we struggle with every standard. It just may be even one standard in that set that we struggle with that brings down the entire average. As we move on past this one, just kind of wanted to show you which standards that we commonly miss to kind of give you a reference. And we were fortunate in May of 2019 to get some partnership information, and they ranked the top 5 standards that they were having difficulty with in order. So I took the same concept with our monitoring results. And as a network, we struggle with tripartite compliance. And that is getting, a lot of it is making sure that we get people on the board in a timely manner and that we have the correct ratio. And as you all know, this is an ongoing issue, and it's one that every agency struggles with. Just, you have to keep on top of it all the time. But that was the biggest issue that we had as a state. We had some similarities, 5.7 and 5.5, those standards. We compared nationally. And then we kind of deviated when you start looking at further rankings, number 4, number 5. Those were different than what we were seeing nationally. And I added to the bottom of this slide what the standards were, just so later on when you're reviewing them, you can kind of have a comparison. On the next slide, I actually wanted to show the percentages that we were missing the standards with. So you can see that 41% of the agencies struggled with standard 4.5 and 6.3. And most of those revolved around just adding additional details. There was a framework, there was a structure, but we needed a little bit more depth of knowledge and information provided. Half of the agencies missed 5.6, which is a conflict of interest statement for your governing board. Most of that is just creating a tracking system and documenting that each one of the members have signed off on that, because you have to do that every 2 years. A good recommendation is just to do it annually, and then that way you never have an issue with it. And it's also good for management to kind of know, life happens to people. One year they may not have a conflict, but someone gets a new job, or someone picks up, one of your board members picks up a new contract, and maybe they do have a conflict. So it's always good for you to know those things. So doing it annually is a good best business practice recommendation. 59% of the agencies were missing some bylaws. 64% had some board attendance, quorum issues, no governing board orientation, and that's just all documentation. We see tripartite compliance show up again, and then lastly, inconsistent hiring practices. And mostly that's just documentation. As we go through and randomly select files, there's certain paperwork that's missing, not accurately has the appropriate sign-offs. So that kind of concludes just what we saw last year, or the last 2 years. And now we can move to kind of looking forward and what's the next 3 years going to bring for us. And this is just a high-level overview. We're not going into great detail with a lot of this. Every agency was sent out in January a revised CAR tool, and it was nice because anything new was in green. So it's really is a good quick reference to go find out, hey, what's different? The new CAR tool has a lot of changes, but a lot of the information's the same. We just moved some things around. We moved a lot of things around to make it easier. So if there was something under 5.1 where talked about the requirements in your bylaws for tripartite compliance, well, we moved reviewing that underneath the bylaws in 5.10. And Justin was going to talk a lot about the different movements that we had with FISCAL. So it's not that we added a lot of stuff. We just moved a lot of things around, but there were a few additions. So these are some highlights, some things I want you to be aware of. The first one is 4.7, and this is implemented required action items. And this new standard is basically at the end of the monitoring, an agency is required to do a required action plan. And you're basically telling us, hey, we're going to do certain items in a certain time period. And if you're on a required action plan, we take that as face value. We don't come back and harass you every 5 minutes saying, hey, I need to see this or that. However, when we do come back for our next monitoring visit, those items that you said that were done should have been done. And so the new standard is basically just if items that you had indicated you were going to accomplish, you didn't, then there's a possibility it would show up under this standard. I'm going to turn over 10.6 and 11.4 to Justin because he's going to talk about them. Justin?
Yep, thank you, Steve. 10.6 is a new standard. It's the Comprehensive Information Resource Security Policy standard. This one all revolves around cybersecurity. Here in 2020, we know that cybersecurity issues have been happening for some time now. At the state level, we are constantly going through cybersecurity training. And we even know that, at least one of our agencies have dealt with a cybersecurity situation. Sometimes this ends in loss of assets, loss of time, loss of personnel, who knows, but they really cause major problems. And with this standard, we're wanting to just see our agencies start to incorporate some sort of cybersecurity policy. Some of the things that we're looking for are identification of training opportunities for staff, unauthorized disclosure of confidential information. We want to see some sort of language about multi-factor authorizations, the use of unauthorized devices, et cetera, et cetera. And if you look at the CAR tool, there is a long list of guidance there of some of the things we're looking for. At this time, we're not looking for anything specific, but we just want to see that there's movement in the direction of securing our information and resources, and are moving in the direction of having a comprehensive information resource and security policy. 11.4, this one, it revolves around the physical inspection of an inventory, specifically at least every 2 years. This one actually used to be part of 11.2, which is the schedule of inventory. It was something that we looked at. It wasn't necessarily something that we graded upon, and sometimes it may have been more of a recommendation, but now going forward, it is going to be a standalone standard where we are going to make sure that a physical inspection of your inventory has been accounted for at least every 2 years. And this will be based upon that schedule of inventory that each agency should have. Okay, and back to Steve for 2.6.
Thanks, Justin. So as you can kind of see, we, like with the comprehensive resource policy, we're looking forward. Part of our job is to see potential issues in the future and try to get out ahead of them. So that's what that standard involves. 11.4, that's actually that's a federal requirement. We've just never really actively enforced it, and it became an issue. Same as 2.6. 2.6 is actually comes from the Indiana Code. When you start reading the Community Action Agency legislation, this is one of the bullet points in that long list of items. And really, it's just as an agency, documenting the things that you guys are already doing, demonstrating that you encourage other local agencies who provide similar CSBG services. And that could be plan and administer assistance on a common and cooperative basis. So that might be your partnership list, an MOA, a coalition that you're involved with. Another part of that, kind of an and/or, is you provide training and technical assistance to those agencies who provide similar CSBG services. Maybe those trainings are provided through presentations, joint projects that you work on. Maybe you do a local community needs assessment and you partner with several of the other agencies to do that. That would be an example of documenting that action and showing how you're meeting that standard. So it is a new standard. As I said, though, it was part of Indiana Code. But I believe that everyone is doing these things. It's being mindful and documenting, hey, this is how we're being effective in eliminating poverty in our community, and this is how we're working with other agencies who have a similar mission as we do. In 7.2.1, these are policies that were added to the personnel policy. And the nice thing is a lot of agencies are already doing elements of this. So it's not that the network as a whole is not doing any of it. Some of you have some really good policies on this stuff. Some of it is where we got the idea when you start looking at and getting in depth about the thoughtfulness in some of your personnel policies and how some of your policies would be good statewide. So the social media policy, it's basically providing details on how your agency approaches social media. And even similar to the information resource policy, this is just kind of the world we live in now. And the policies and the procedures we create provide guidance on how we're going to handle situations and what our philosophy as an agency is on them. Nice thing is with the social media policy, and NASCAP has a great resource called Harnessing the Conversation. It's a social media guide. So that could be a valuable resource as you develop this policy if you don't have one. So there are some resources out there. The other one is a political activity policy. It's basically you're defining both, allowable, off-duty, and prohibited activities for your staff. Community action is rooted or founded in activism and being proponents of your community, specifically targeted, obviously, for the elimination of poverty. But in the early days, activism was a huge part of it. And to keep with our core roots, an agency should have a political activity policy that helps guide and kind of structure your agency's philosophy. Nice thing is CapLaw has a great resource on this. It's called a Sample Community Action Political Activity Policy. So I recommend if you don't have this to go to their website and kind of look at that. Obviously, the Hatch Act is that's a federal law, but that would be more recent where you could look at that and as you're crafting your policy, use the Hatch Act as guidance. So it's just information to have that you can present to your employees who don't necessarily know that this is where these resources, they wouldn't necessarily know to go to the Hatch Act. But as an administrator, you could, and then setting the policy will provide them guidance. So as we go to the next slide, we are some other new requirements that we have implemented. This is a big one, Section 3, as everyone remembers, and no one ever really liked. IHCDA provided a community needs assessment statewide, and then there was always little components for each agency. And for various reasons over the years, it never really provided you as an agency, I think, the information that you felt that you needed to make effective decisions. So we've kind of rethought our process on the community needs assessment. And through some research and talking to other executive directors, there are, and I'll use Head Start, that's the one that comes to mind. For those of you who have Head Start, you're required to also do a community needs assessment every 3 years. It's just, we never allowed you to use it because we paid for, the state paid for theirs. And so we was like, this is the one you got to use. But going forward, we've kind of opened the floodgates on that. And we allow an agency to use the community needs assessment of their choice, with the condition that you're going to have to want to review Section 3, specifically Standard 3.2, 3.3, and 3.4, and make sure that your community needs assessment has all those requirements in it. And as long as it does that, you can use whatever needs assessment you wish. So that gives you as an agency greater flexibility. And what we also hope is if you're a Head Start agency or other agency who requires a community needs assessment, you don't have to spend additional money creating it. So this hopefully is to your benefit. So I encourage you to read Section 3, especially if you're going to hire a consultant or you're going to do your own needs assessment. There's a lot of great details that came out of this. The information can be found in one of the NASCAS. They actually have how to monitor your community needs assessment as a guide, and a lot of that information came from there. So feel free to read the CAR tool, go to the NASCAS website for their resources, but just know that you have the flexibility now of not using the state one because we're not going to do that anymore. We're going to put it back in your hands. 510 is, these are two new parts of the bylaws, voting rights of members. And basically, we just want you to say in there, each member only gets one vote. It could be just that simple. New board member approval. This is rooted in IM 182. That members of a community action board shall be selected by the entity, which is your organization, your agency. There has been some confusion in the past as to how someone becomes a board member. So once the potential board member has followed the correct selection process and they've made their way to the board, it is now the full board's responsibility to vote them onto the board. Keep in mind, you're under no obligation to do so. So an example would be if you have a public official and they say, hey, I'd like this person to be a representative of me. You're not required to take that. If the board feels that this person, maybe they don't like community action agencies, so they don't like someone or you have issue with them, then this is the way the board can say, I'm sorry, we don't want that. We don't want to do that. So this policy is designed to give control back to the board. So think of it as, what is my selection process and then my board approval process, not just because someone was low income and they were voted on and they were voted at a democratic selection process doesn't mean that's the person you have to choose if you don't wish, if the full board does not wish. So it gives you a little flexibility. The other one is 5.6. Conflict of interest statements. All we're asking is that on all of your conflict of interest statements, there is a place to allow for a written disclosure. So if someone says they have a conflict, they have to be able to tell you what it is. That's what we're going to look for on that. 6.2, this is new, and so this is effective of this year going forward. So if you already have a strategic plan in place, we are not going to require this, but if you create your strategic plan on February 1st and going forward, we are now going to ask that there is a strategic plan compliance summary page. Now this actually is a short section that clearly makes one or more of the 3 objectives and explains how they're addressed. So that's the guidelines from the partnership. And NASCAP further asks that to explain how you meet the standard. So the objectives we talked about, the 3 objectives, the reduction of poverty, the revitalization of low-income communities, and the empowerment of people with low income to become more self-sufficient. So the summary compliance page is basically saying, this is how I meet this standard. So going forward, this will be something that you want to add. And a lot of that will come from your strategic planning discussion notes as to why and how certain things got on your plan. You're just going to take parts of those notes and put them into your summary page to explain this is how we meet the standard. This is how we're identifying the 3 objectives. As we go to the next slide, these are some other additional standards. 7.2.1, this is found under the Code of Ethics in the personnel policy. And this comes from the Federal Register, that all employers adopt ethics compliance programs. So you already have that as a component of your personnel policy. What's new is the next sentence in that Federal Register was train all employees on this. So you're going to want to have, like, through your annual training, orientation, whichever method you choose, you want to document that all employees are trained on the Code of Ethics and compliance of that. So the first part of the Federal Register, like I said, you're already doing. It was already in your personnel policy. The second part is just train all employees on this. 7.7 is the whistleblower policy. And you must include anti-retaliation language. Basically, the whistleblower policy provides protection and encourages an individual to communicate an issue. So specifically saying that you're not going to retaliate for someone for doing so encourages them and lets them know that it's safe for me to follow these methods of reporting and nothing will happen to me for doing such. Because we're looking out for the agency, and the agency is in the best interest when someone steps forward and says, hey, someone is doing something that violates our Code of Ethics, one of our policies, maybe stealing money from the agency or a program, which ultimately affects the individuals in our community who need those services. So we want to encourage whistleblowing if it happens. And we have had within the state several agencies who have experienced fraud. And inevitably, it's been someone who's come forward or who has shed light to point someone in a particular direction and say, hey, you need to look at this. And through them to due diligence, they're found that there's been fraud. So the whistleblower policy has been used recently. It's been effective. But we just want to make sure that the anti-retaliation language is in there so they know that, hey, I'm encouraged to do this. We also recommend, though, that you have more than one reporting method. So we encourage you to look at, is there multiple ways that someone could report an issue? So that's just a recommendation. Now I'm going to turn 11.2 over to Justin.
Thank you, Steve. We included this here because we have experienced a lot of questions around what needs to be included on the schedule of inventory. I know I've personally seen the schedule of inventory reported in numerous different ways, and then there's always questions attached to that. And again, we're talking about the agency-wide schedule of inventory. You may have one for weatherization that's a standalone schedule of inventory, but for this, we're really talking about an agency-wide schedule of inventory. And you may recognize this from 2 CFR 200 as the definition of equipment, and I would say that probably is by design. But we just wanted to clarify here that we are looking for any asset that is valued at $5,000 or greater with a usable life greater than 1 year. We're not looking for screwdrivers or drill bits. We're looking for those big ticket items that are more of a capital expense. So again, if you have any questions about that, feel free to ask, but we had a lot of questions about what needs to be included on the schedule of inventory, and here is how we've defined what needs to be included. Okay. And I believe the next slide we start getting into some of the fiscal updates. And I will go through these. I'll actually go through these fairly quickly. There's a couple that I will spend some time touching on a little bit, but we have made a lot of updates to the fiscal section or the organizational analysis part of the CAR tool and the CAR monitoring. We've moved categories around. We've shuffled some standards from one category to another. All of this was just general housekeeping actions, trying to streamline some of the flow of the monitoring, what we're looking at and why we're looking at it, and what makes sense to go here versus there. In all reality, there's only been a couple material changes to organizational analysis, and we'll get into those. So, start here with category 10. As we said, we've made some changes. So category 10 used to be category 12. It was internal controls analysis, and it still is internal controls analysis. Standard 12.5 was moved to standard 8.14, and you'll see that in the CAR tool, and that's kind of immaterial. It was just kind of cleaning up that standard. We did adopt standard 10.6, and we went over that one as that was the comprehensive information resource and security policy standard. So that is a new one. That would be a material change, right? Category 11, this used to be category 10. It used to be inventory management analysis, and it's still inventory management analysis. We simplified standard 11.2 by adding 11.3, but we also added that 11.4 as well, which we went over. 11.3, the only thing that's new there is when we were looking at the schedule of inventory, we were always making sure that you were including everything that you needed to include. And we kind of just went over that with 11.2, the definition of equipment. And 11.3 will actually test that. So rather than making 11.2 a standard where we cover different aspects of the schedule of inventory, we just broke out those separate aspects to make it a little more clear and defined. Next slide. Category 12 used to be category 11, and I won't go through the same shtick on all these, but it used to be procurement analysis, and it's still procurement analysis. We have, again, simplified standard 12.1 by adding 12.4. 12.4 is just going to be testing the documentation. So let me go back and standard 12.1 is going to be testing, did you follow our procurement procedures? Did you follow your own procurement policy? Are all those in line with federal guidance? And one of those things was, having documentation. Well, we've broken out the documentation piece and moved that to standard 12.4. We did reword 12.3, but again, that is very immaterial. If you look at the CAR tool, you'll see the green write-ups on that, and nothing changed with that. Nothing changed with how we're looking at it, and nothing changed on how it's being scored. Category 13, payment and reimbursement process analysis. We removed the complexity of standard 13.1 by breaking some of those pieces out. And then we also moved 13.6, which is a new one, to this category from category 14. 13.6 is credit card statements, must have source documents that used to be included in the following category. However, when we're reviewing that, we always review that within the claims and the claims documentation. So it just made sense to bring that over to the payment and reimbursement process analysis category. Next slide. Category 14 is the fiscal process analysis category. In this category, we did a couple things. We actually took the ratios and we moved those out and created a standalone category for the ratios. And then we also took 4 standards and combined those into 2 standards. So 14.3 and 14.4 were revolved around, the accounts receivable ledger. Does that match the interim accounts receivable balance sheet? The accounts payable ledger, does that match the interim accounts payable balance sheet? We took both of those standards and just combined them into one. And so that's now the organization's aging reports reconciled to the balance sheets. So we just kind of cleaned that up a little bit. And same thing with 14.4, which used to be 14.6 and 14.7, which revolved around whether or not the agency has a standalone budget for each program. Funds are tracked separately by contract and by program. Does the agency have a chart of accounts organized by program? That was 2 separate standards there that just made sense to combine into one for simplicity's sake. But other than that, no material changes in category 14. And here's the big one I want to talk about. I want to talk about category 15. First of all, I wanted to mention that we removed 2 of the ratios, the receivable turnover rate and the average collection period. So those 2 ratios are now gone. We're not checking those anymore. And the biggest update that we've had, and this is definitely a material change, we are now going to, instead of only looking at the interim balance sheet and income statement to calculate your ratios, and that depends on whatever time of the year we come in to monitor, right? We're now actually going to go back and look at the end of year financials for the previous 3 years by using the audited financial statements, and we will calculate the ratios 3 times on a yearly basis. And then we will also calculate the interim ratios as well. And those will not have, the interim ratios will not be graded as strongly as your end of year ratios. This is something we've had several questions, many comments, several concerns about, we only calculating the ratios on the interim basis. Depending on what time of year it is, the ratios may be worse than they would be on, typically at the end of the year. So with that being said, we decided to go ahead and do quite a bit more work here, but I think it's also to maintain the accuracy and the integrity of the monitoring by going through and doing a full sweep of ratios on a yearly basis and also on the interim basis. And depending on how those ratios turn out, we will develop a score based on that. So that was the big change that we wanted to go over with the fiscal section. If you guys have any questions, feel free to ask, but that was something that we felt strongly about, and that's something that we ultimately decided to kind of make the whole monitoring process of the fiscal section much better and stronger. And I think we'll go back to Steve here for some of the highlights for success.
Well, we've kind of given everyone a quick overview of, hey, these are some of the changes that we've had in the new CAR tool, and kind of given a general idea as to why. But we also want to talk about what can agencies always be doing proactively to ensure success during a monitoring. And so here's just a list of some things to look at. I love a detailed succession plan. And there are some great resources out there that we'll talk about in a minute. But, for an agency, the executive director reports to the board does the hiring for that position. The board, even though it may have qualified and skilled individuals in the various areas within the community, they're still a volunteer board. So a detailed succession plan is extremely important and guides them in a time of turmoil for an agency. Because when an executive leaves, even under the best of circumstances, there's always little hiccups here and there. But if they leave because they have to be fired, or something serious happens to them and they no longer can perform their duties, a detailed succession plan is a roadmap for that agency. So the more information you provide in it, the more thought, then you're basically providing success for that board and for everyone who's employed there. So I'm a big fan of the detailed succession plan. We have other things. Please document your governing board trainings. 511 is have accurate governing board minutes with sufficient detail. I'm not saying you got to have paragraph upon paragraph, but when you review the minutes, did it capture comments and questions? Did you get the sense of what was occurring? And especially for leadership staff, that there's a lot of standards that revolve around the board minutes. Actually, 46% of the standards are directly or indirectly related to board minutes. So making sure that certain things are captured and documented. Did the board review something? Did the board vote on something? Was there a discussion on something? All relates back to the CAR tool. So if you put any of your time and energy and effort into anything, if it's 5.11, then you know that you'll at least have a chance of mastering 46% of the organizational standards. 6.3 is, hey, we're going to have strategic plans, but make sure that you have SMART goals. And 10.1 is make sure that you have a documented process and sign-offs for employees and board receiving benefits. You should have a policy internally, and you should be following that. We check up on those. We randomly select different files. So we're going to want to make sure that all the appropriate levels have signed off on people receiving those benefits. In section 17 of the CAR is best business practices. And of course, always please read the CAR tool. There's a lot of information we have not communicated during this presentation. There's a lot of details here and there. This was just a high-level highlight. We did add definitions to the appendix as well, and that, especially for newer staff, could be really good as far as reading that and understanding some of the language that you find in the CAR tool and what we're referring to or what something means to help better understand how you may want to meet a standard. The next slide talks about local resources, and there are a lot of them out there. So some things that you can develop internally that we've seen other, and this kind of comes from all the agencies along with our own experience, but the first thing is, please encourage you develop standard operating procedures for your key management positions. That's also a bonus point, so yippee if you do it. But again, kind of falls in the line of the succession planning. When something happens to someone and someone else needs to step in, SOPs are not going to be able to allow them to do it verbatim, but it'll at least give them more information to be successful, especially when deadlines are looming and the fiscal person is now sick at home. Oh, I got an SOP on that. The next person up can step in and kind of submit that report when it needs to happen, as an example. Governing board calendar of events. And I know I put a note. You can see the Community Action Partnership website. They've got a calendar of board action. Gives a good example. I encourage you to do it for all of your programs, not just CSBG, but put everything on a master calendar and get in a rhythm of this is when we do things. And in that way, you're always making sure you don't miss something. Same concept for a leadership calendar events. Generally, they have to do stuff in preparation for things going to the board. Governing board recruitment and retention plan. That's a big one, because we talked about earlier tripartite compliance issues, and it always being an active, ongoing search to make sure I got my next board member already to step in when it occurs, when a vacancy occurs. So board recruitment and retention plan is key to making sure that you're hitting your tripartite compliance guidelines and benchmarks. Strategic planning scoring card. That's a good one, just as a quick reference. One of the standards is, you talk about, actually two of the standards revolve around the board receiving information and being part of the strategic planning process. It's 6.5, but it's also linked back to 9.3. And so a scorecard is a nice quick visual. So that's always just kind of a nice helpful thing. Develop processes for capturing outcomes. We all know that we're in the midst right now of doing our annual reports, and outcomes is outweighing outputs. So develop your processes, review all of your programs, and figure out where are the outcomes in all my different programs, and then how do I communicate that back to the person who compiles all this. You got your new hire checklist, your offboarding checklist. Those are all just good tools. IHCDA has developed a few as well, but I also encourage you to go to the CSBG website under the partner portal, because there is a lot of great information that Veronica has uploaded. The tools that are mentioned here are there, as well as others. So that's just a good place to kind of routinely visit and see if there's anything new. And the last slide is basically just some national resources. And I mentioned Community Action Partnership and Capital specifically because they have the most variety of things. And these are just a few of examples. There's a lot more out there. I was kind of looking at the partnership the other day, and I think the list was like a page long of all the different things. So if you're having troubles in your agencies, you're having issues, go to these national resources. Odds are they've already developed some kind of guidance or tools or other methods that might help you in tackling your ongoing problems, organizational issues. But the partnerships, the national partnerships, do a great job of providing information. So feel free to, if you haven't checked on those, make sure you go to them on a routine basis as well. So with that said, I know that, we're in the midst of a national crisis right now. And I will tell you that when we come in and monitor you in the future, we always monitor on what the existing policy is at the time. So we have a lot of new COVID-19 policies coming out. They're taking effect even today. And I will assure you that we take those deadlines into consideration anytime that we're monitoring activities. So if a policy changes in the middle of the year, we're going to monitor you up until that policy change one way, and then going forward, we'll monitor you a different way. So we do take those things into consideration. And we always have done that, but I know that with the things that are going on right now, that might become a bigger concern. And that, we're here to work with you as much as possible, as long as that you're working inside of the rules and regulations, that there are rational justifications for the things that you're doing and things that are documented accurately. And with that, then we will work with you. So I'm going to now turn it back over to Veronica.
All right, thank you, Steve and Justin. I know I learned a lot from your comments as you went through the presentation, and hopefully everyone else on the line did as well. So this is our Q&A session. We set aside a lot of time for this, expecting to get a flood of questions from everyone. And so far we're not seeing that, which hopefully is a good thing. Hopefully that means that we explained everything in a way that makes sense. So the number one question we've had so far is actually about the slides and whether or not they will be available after today. And the answer is yes. So the slides from this presentation, along with the recording, will be made available. I'll go ahead and email the slides pretty soon after this to everyone that was registered today. And then we'll post the slides along with the recording to the CSBG page on our website, which Steve referenced a couple minutes ago, hopefully in the next couple of days. That's another department that handles that. And I know they've, like everyone else, they've got a lot on their plate right now. So I can't promise that the recording will be posted today or tomorrow, but hopefully in the next couple of days it will be. Along with the recording for this Friday, we have a second webinar scheduled on Friday. It will be covering the same exact slides, so don't feel that you need to attend that webinar, but we'll post both recordings in case you are super interested in hearing everything we have to say about this topic. And the big thing I want to let you all know is that we'll be compiling an FAQ where all the questions that you are currently posting and then all the questions that get posted on Friday, we'll put them all together in one document and provide answers to everything. So that way everyone is getting access to the same information as much as we're able to make that possible. So expect to see those documents posted to the website in the next couple of days. And then I also wanted to make a quick note before we get into some of the other questions that I see are now starting to pop up, that we're still hoping to do an in-person training on the CARD tool, specifically focused on sharing best practices. That was the aspect of the in-person trainings that we were most excited for, that we think would have the greatest impact for all of you is being able to hear from each other how you're meeting these standards, how you're documenting everything. It sounds like that is basically what makes or breaks monitoring a lot of times, is how much you're actually documenting what you're doing. So we want to make sure that you all have the opportunity to hear from each other on that topic. We just at this point can't promise when that will happen or how exactly. So I just want to put that in your ear that hopefully in the next, before the end of the year, we can do that. But now moving to your policy questions. Steve and Justin, I hope you guys are prepared to answer some of these. I'll start going through the ones. And if I miss any questions that are popping up, I do apologize to attendees. And like I said, we'll include all of them on the FAQ that we post later. So the first question is where on the website that you can find the information about the card tool. And Steve, do you know off the top of your head where on the page the monitoring section is? Is that towards the bottom of the page?
Of the CSBG website?
Yes.
I actually don't know where, I know Brad has put the card tool on the CSBG portal. I'm just not I'm not sure where on the CSBG tab he put it.
Okay, I can try and look that up. While you answer the next question, will the monitoring review continue as scheduled in light of the COVID-19 issue?
Yes, our monitoring schedule has not changed. The format in which we do it will change. Now, obviously, we're hopeful that things get under control as soon as possible, but in the meantime, we've already reached out to the first couple agencies that will be monitored. We'll be doing a lot more desktop and email, kind of doing things remotely as much as possible to maintain our distance. But there will be a time where we need to have to come on site. That is actually for one of the reasons we're through the federal regulations, we're required to be on site. So we have to at least show up for one day, but it may be later. So we're going to work with each individually and kind of determine what that looks like. That was the long answer to the yes, we're still doing the schedule. But since I've got this moment, I do want to apologize to everybody because I'm old school and I find it extremely difficult to give a webinar where I'm sitting just staring at a screen. So I really enjoy the personal interaction a lot more. So I'm apologizing for coming across as a little bit more robotic and less interactive.
Hey, I think you did a great job. I did not think of you as being robotic at all. Going back to the question about the IHCDA webpage for CSBG, and actually it looks like we got a second question about that. To be completely honest, one thing I will note about finding the webpage is Google. Even for myself, I don't go through our website. I will just do a generic Google search for IHCDA plus CSBG. And the first result that pops up is the webpage that Steve and I are referencing. And actually, I can maybe try and bring that up. Let's see if I can.
Well, I can also tell you if you go to our website, if you go, there's like a big thing that shows people holding hands or something. And if you click on that, that's now the partner portal. And then it takes you to a list of all of the programs, and you can go to CSBG and get to where Veronica is right now. So there's two ways of getting there.
Yeah, and so it looks like the monitoring section, which is where the card tool is listed, is about 2/3 of the way down the page. Or if you just scroll from the bottom, it's 2 sections up. So this is the section that Steve has been referencing specifically for the card tool. So hopefully that answers a couple of the questions. And let me take it back to the presentation so it looks a little bit prettier.
See, now I wouldn't have been able to do that, so kudos to you.
Okay, next question. Actually, this might be for Justin. Are fiscal ratios all weighted the same? If not, what ratios are weighted the highest?
Yeah, so specifically, each separate ratio is weighted the same. However, with the new way we are going to be monitoring the ratios, where we're looking at the year-end audited financial ratios as well as the interim, the year-end financial statement, audited financial statement ratios, those will be weighted greater than the interim ratios. And then also to clarify, I know Steve kind of touched on this one a little bit. As far as the COVID-19 is concerned, I would go out, I would suspect that financial auditors are going to really get used to making a note in the audited financial statements of 2020 for everyone that, you know, numbers are probably going to be different compared to the year before and the year after due to COVID-19 complications. So I would just make sure you've got documentation, make sure you're keeping notes and keeping track of the complications that COVID-19 is causing. And that will probably turn up in your audited financial statement. We'll go through that and we'll make, you know, the considerations that need to be made. But first and foremost, I hope everyone's doing well with the current situation. Hope all of your agencies are performing fine and found adequate ways to keep employees engaged and working. I know that's probably the biggest thing on everyone's mind right now, not ratios, but when it comes to ratios and we look at those, we will be looking at those the same way we have, but we will be looking at the year-end ratios, which will be weighted greater than the interim ratios. And we will be mindful of any notes and different considerations that are left in those audit reports.
All right, thank you, Justin. Next question. There was some confusion about standard 4.7 implemented required action plans. Could you all explain this again?
Oh, certainly. At the end of the monitoring, an agency is, we determine if you're in good standing or if you need to be on a modified QIP or a QIP. And what we generally say is that plan, all the items that are identified as being deficient, you have to create a required action plan, basically saying all of these items, this is how I'm going to address them. Well, for agencies who are in good standing, we are not in ongoing communication after the monitoring has concluded. We basically review your plan, and if we find your plan acceptable, we accept it at face value, and we may touch base with you later on, but since you're in good standing, we kind of, for the most part, we'll touch base with you when we monitor you again. Well, what we have found is some of the items on individuals who were in good standing on the required action plan, they said, hey, I'm going to accomplish something. Well, when we monitored them 3 years later, they hadn't done it. So standard 4.7 is if you say you're going to do something on your action plan, then when we come back and monitor you, we're going to hold you accountable for doing what you said you were going to do. And that's what standard 4.7 is in regards to. Did you do the things you said you were going to do when you said you were going to do them? Hope that helps.
All right, I think so. And if not, feel free to post another question about anything in particular that you'd like a little bit more of an explanation on. The next question is about this year's monitoring schedule. Has that been sent out already?
Yeah, we actually have notified every agency who's going to be monitored this year. We did that back in January to kind of give them a tentative deadline. And we actually haven't started monitoring. It doesn't happen until the end of this month. So everything right now is on schedule. Fortunately, with CSBG, we put in a couple of weeks between each one. So with all things said, hopefully everyone who's been notified, we're sticking to the schedule that we have provided you.
All right, and I would add to that, if anyone has a question about their particular monitoring, go ahead and send that to Steve so we can answer that directly. And it looks like that's all the questions we have for now. So we will go ahead and wrap up. If you think of anything in the next couple of minutes or in the next day or two, you can always email us at IHCDA. Please use that CSBG email so we can better track all the questions that we receive. but we'll make sure to add anything that we think the network needs to know to that FAQ page that we are compiling for the CAR tool. But it looks like we've covered everything. Again, if I missed any questions, I apologize to anyone who needed that answered. We will add that to the FAQ and you can always contact us. But thank you, Steve and Justin. I think that went pretty smoothly, passing back between everyone. So hats off to you guys for keeping that going as smoothly as you did. And thank you all for everyone who's still on the line. And we'll wrap up today's webinar. If you have any questions, go ahead and contact us. And I think that's it for the day. All right. Have a good day, everyone.